It was 2:47 in the morning when I found it. I remember this clearly because I had been sitting at my desk since just after midnight, going through a stack of research papers I had been meaning to read for months. My tea had gone cold. The building was completely silent, and I was about to close my laptop and go to bed when I decided to open one more file, a metabolic study out of Kyoto University that a colleague had forwarded to me almost 6 weeks earlier. I had meant to read it. I just never had the time. I was skimming, half asleep. And then I stopped. And buried in the appendix of that study was something that changed how I will practice medicine for the rest of my career. I am not someone who gets easily excited by research. I have been a practicing physician for over 30 years. I have read thousands of studies. I have seen trends come and go, superfoods rise and fall, miracle diets collapse under the weight of their own exaggeration. I am, by nature, skeptical. My patients would probably say I am too skeptical. But what I read that night, this small paragraph tucked into the supplementary data of a paper most people will never read, it was not a trend. It was a mechanism. A specific, well-documented biological mechanism that explained something I had been observing in my own patients for years without understanding why. The question I had always struggled to answer was this: why do two people walk the same distance at the same pace for the same amount of time, and one of them burns dramatically more fat than the other? I had always assumed it was genetics, or fitness level, or some vague metabolic difference I could not control. But the Kyoto study and the chain of research it pointed me toward suggested something far more precise. It suggested the answer had nothing to do with the walk itself. It had everything to do with what happened in the 30 minutes before the walk began. Specifically, what you ate or what you consumed in that window. Let me explain what I mean, because this requires a small amount of biology, and I want you to understand it properly. Not because it is complicated, but because once you understand the mechanism, you will never forget it, and you will never do your morning walk the same way again. When you wake up in the morning, your body is in a particular metabolic state. You have been fasting for 7, 8, perhaps 9 hours. Your blood glucose is low, your insulin is low, and because of this, your body has already begun a process of shifting its preferred fuel source away from glucose and towards stored fat. This is sometimes called the fasted state, and for decades we have known that exercise performed in this state tends to produce greater fat oxidation, meaning the body burns a higher percentage of fat as fuel compared to exercising after a meal. This is not new. This part, we knew. What the Kyoto study added, and what stopped me cold at 3 in the morning, was a precise understanding of what happens at the cellular level when you introduce one specific compound into that fasted state just before movement begins. The compound is called resistant starch. Now, before you click away thinking this is about some exotic supplement or expensive powder, stop. Because resistant starch is not exotic. It is not expensive. You almost certainly have a source of it sitting in your kitchen right now. And in a moment, I will tell you exactly what it is and exactly how much you need. But first, I need you to understand why it works. Because the why is what makes this permanent knowledge rather than just another tip you forget by next week. Normal starch, the kind in freshly cooked rice, fresh bread, hot pasta, is digested quickly. It breaks down into glucose almost immediately. That glucose enters your bloodstream, your insulin rises to manage it, and your body shifts back into glucose burning mode. You have, in effect, switched off the fat-burning state your overnight fast created. Resistant starch is different. It resists digestion in the small intestine. It passes through largely intact and feeds the bacteria in your large intestine instead. This means two critical things happen. First, your blood glucose and insulin response is dramatically blunted, far lower than with regular starch. Second, when those gut bacteria ferment the resistant starch, they produce something called short-chain fatty acids, particularly one called butyrate. And butyrate, it turns out, is a remarkably powerful signal molecule that directly stimulates fat oxidation. The Kyoto study found that subjects who consumed a specific, small portion of resistant starch approximately 20 to 30 minutes before a moderate intensity walk showed measurably higher rates of fat oxidation throughout the walk compared to a fasted control group and compared to a group that consumed regular starch. The difference was not marginal. Fat oxidation in the resistant starch group was elevated by what the researchers described as approximately 60 to 80% compared to the fasted group, and more than double the fat oxidation of the regular starch group. I will say that again. The people who ate 1 tablespoon of the right food before their walk burned more than twice as much fat during that walk compared to people who ate regular carbohydrates, and significantly more than people who walked completely fasted. Now, when I read that number for the first time at 3 in the morning, I thought I had misread it. I went back. I checked the methodology. I checked the sample size. I looked at the confidence intervals. And then I sat back in my chair and thought about every patient I had ever told to walk on an empty stomach to maximize fat burning. I had told dozens of patients this, hundreds maybe, and I had been giving them advice that was not wrong exactly. Fasted walking does burn fat, but it was incomplete. It was missing something simple that could have doubled their results. This is the part that kept me awake, because the answer was so accessible. You are not talking about a drug. You are not talking about a supplement stack or a complicated protocol. You are talking about 1 spoon of a very specific food at a very specific time. That is it. 1 spoon, 20 minutes before you walk. So what is the food? The highest concentration of resistant starch available from a common, inexpensive kitchen food is cold cooked rice. Specifically rice that has been cooked, then cooled in the refrigerator for at least 12 hours. The cooling process causes a retrogradation. The starch molecules rearrange into a crystalline structure that your digestive enzymes cannot break apart. It becomes, structurally, a different substance than hot rice, and it carries one of the highest resistant starch contents of any food you can prepare at home. 1 tablespoon of cold-cooked rice, roughly 15 grams, contains approximately 2 to 3 grams of resistant starch in this retrograded form. That is enough. You do not need more. In fact, consuming too much before exercise can cause digestive discomfort, and the studies showing the fat oxidation benefits were using small, precise amounts in this range. 1 tablespoon. That is the dose. That is the protocol. Now, I want to spend a moment on the timing, because this matters more than most people realize. The butyrate signal generated by resistant starch fermentation does not happen instantly. Gut fermentation is a slower process. But the insulin-sparing effect, the blunted glucose response, happens quickly, within 15 to 20 minutes of consumption. And it is this effect, combined with the already low fasted insulin levels in the morning, that creates the specific hormonal environment where fat oxidation peaks. If you eat the cold rice and walk immediately, you lose some of the benefit. If you eat it and wait an hour, the window has passed and other metabolic signals begin to shift. The 20 to 30 minute window is not arbitrary. It maps directly onto the biochemistry. This is why precision matters here. I also want to address the insulin question directly, because I know many people following low-carbohydrate diets or managing blood sugar will immediately ask, does this not raise insulin? Does this not break the fast? The answer is nuanced. Yes, any carbohydrate will produce some insulin response, but resistant starch produces a response that is substantially smaller than regular starch. Studies have consistently shown a reduction in postprandial glucose and insulin of 40 to 50% compared to equivalent amounts of regular starch. For most healthy individuals, this small insulin blip does not meaningfully disrupt the fasted fat-burning state. The net effect, as the Kyoto study and several subsequent studies have confirmed, is still a dramatic increase in fat oxidation, not a decrease. For individuals with diabetes or significant insulin resistance, I would recommend speaking with your own physician before making changes. But for the general population, the data is clear. Now, I want to tell you about something else I discovered as I went deeper into this research over the following weeks. Because the resistant starch mechanism was only the first layer. The second layer involves what resistant starch does to your body over time, not just on the morning you consume it, but cumulatively, over days and weeks of consistent use. The gut bacteria that ferment resistant starch, primarily a group called bifidobacteria and certain species of lactobacillus, respond to consistent resistant starch intake by proliferating. They grow, and as they grow, the baseline production of short-chain fatty acids in your gut increases. This has an effect that lasts far beyond any single morning walk. It shifts your resting metabolic state. It increases your body's baseline sensitivity to insulin. It reduces chronic low-grade inflammation, which is itself a significant suppressor of fat metabolism. In other words, the first time you take 1 spoon of cold rice before your walk, you get a 60 to 80% boost in fat burning during that walk. But after 2 weeks of doing this consistently, your gut microbiome has changed in ways that make you a more efficient fat burner even on the days you do not walk, even at rest. The compound effect of this is genuinely significant. A 2022 study published in Cell Metabolism followed subjects over an 8-week period of daily resistant starch supplementation. By week 4, resting fat oxidation had increased by an average of 23%. By week 8, the group consuming resistant starch had lost, on average, 2.5 times more body fat than the control group, despite eating the same total calories and performing the same amount of exercise. 2.5 times more fat loss. Same calories, same exercise. The only difference was one small intervention in the morning. I want you to think about what that means for a moment. Most people trying to lose fat are already doing something. They are already walking. They are already watching what they eat. They are not lazy. They are just missing this one specific piece. And the studies suggest that missing this piece costs them more than half their potential results. Not because they are doing anything wrong, because they are doing something incomplete. This is not a small optimization. This is the difference between spending 6 months on a walking routine and being disappointed, versus spending 6 months and seeing a transformation. The effort is identical. The output is completely different. I have been telling my patients about this since that night in my study, and the feedback has been consistent. One patient of mine, a woman in her late 50s, who had been walking 40 minutes every morning for over a year with minimal fat loss, began the 1 spoon protocol. Within 3 weeks, she reported that her clothes were fitting differently. Within 6 weeks, she had lost 4 kilograms of fat without changing her diet or increasing her walking time. Same walk, same body, 1 spoon. Another patient, a man in his early 60s with moderately elevated fasting blood sugar, began the protocol and returned to my clinic 2 months later with fasting glucose that had dropped by 11 points without any medication change. The resistant starch effect on insulin sensitivity had been doing its work quietly every morning. These are not anomalies. The mechanism is solid. The evidence is consistent. The barrier to entry is essentially 0. But I want to be honest with you about something because I think it is important. Resistant starch is not a magic substitute for movement. The reason this protocol works so well is that it amplifies fat burning during exercise, specifically during moderate intensity aerobic exercise like walking. If you take 1 spoon of cold rice and sit on the couch, you will still get some microbiome benefit over time, but you will not get the dramatic fat oxidation effect. The spoon primes the engine. The walk runs it. You need both. What makes this so practical is that most people are already walking, or they intend to. A morning walk is one of the most commonly adopted health behaviors there is. People are already doing the hard part. The spoon is not asking you to do more. It is asking you to do the same thing, but smarter. 1 tablespoon of yesterday's cold rice from the refrigerator, eaten 20 minutes before you walk out the door. That is the entire intervention. Let me also address one common question I have received, which is whether this works for evening walks as well as morning walks. The answer is yes, with one modification. In the morning, you are already in a fasted state, which provides the baseline low insulin environment that makes resistant starch most effective. If you walk in the evening, you are likely not in a fasted state. You have eaten meals throughout the day. In this case, the resistant starch still provides meaningful benefit by blunting the insulin response from whatever you last ate, but the effect is somewhat smaller than in the morning fasted state. I still recommend the protocol for evening walkers. Simply maintain the 20 to 30 minute pre-walk timing and keep the portion to 1 tablespoon. Now, I want to spend a few minutes on the question of preparation because I receive a lot of questions about whether the type of rice matters, how long it needs to cool, and whether other forms of resistant starch work equally well. On the question of rice variety, yes, the type of rice matters somewhat. Long-grain white rice and jasmine rice produce slightly higher levels of retrograded resistant starch after cooling compared to short-grain or sushi rice, though all rice varieties produce meaningful amounts. Brown rice cooked and cooled also works well and has the additional benefit of higher fiber content. The differences between varieties are not dramatic enough to be prescriptive. Use whatever rice you normally cook and have available. On the question of cooling time, 12 hours in the refrigerator produces the maximum retrograde crystallization. Studies comparing 2-hour cooling, 6-hour cooling, and 12-plus-hour cooling consistently show that 12 hours produces the highest resistant starch content. Leaving rice in the refrigerator overnight is ideal. Cook it the night before, eat it cold the next morning. This is a natural fit for Japanese households where leftover rice in the refrigerator is already normal. It is 1 tablespoon of something you already have. On the question of reheating, do not reheat it. This is critical. Reheating rice dissolves the retrograde crystalline structure and converts the resistant starch back into regular digestible starch. It must be eaten cold or at room temperature. Cold rice from the refrigerator, straight, 1 tablespoon. No butter, no seasoning needed. Though a small amount of salt or soy sauce does not affect the resistant starch content meaningfully. On the question of other resistant starch sources, cold cooked rice is my recommendation because of its accessibility and consistency of dosing, but other sources include cold cooked potatoes, green bananas, and cooked and cooled legumes. Among these, green bananas have one of the highest resistant starch contents per gram of any food, approximately 6 grams per 100 grams. And 1 small green banana before a walk is another effective option. However, green bananas are not always easily available or palatable, and the portion control is less precise. Cold rice remains the most practical, accessible, and consistent option for daily use. There is one more thing I want to tell you before I close, and it is perhaps the most surprising finding from this entire body of research. In 2023, a research group in Osaka published a study looking at the long-term trajectories of individuals over a 10-year period, specifically examining their morning movement habits and dietary patterns. They were trying to understand why some populations showed persistently low rates of visceral fat accumulation despite aging, a problem that affects almost everyone in westernized societies after the age of 50, when fat redistribution toward the abdominal organs accelerates significantly. What they found was that one of the strongest predictors of low visceral fat at age 70 was a combination of 2 factors: regular moderate morning walking and regular consumption of cold cooked rice. Not because anyone had told these individuals it was a fat-burning protocol, simply because these were traditional habits in certain Japanese communities, the morning walk after a light breakfast of leftover cold rice that had been maintained for generations. The protocol I am describing to you is not something invented in a laboratory. It was discovered in a laboratory. But it was already being lived by certain communities for decades, producing results that we are only now beginning to understand at a mechanistic level. There is something I find deeply moving about that. This idea that wisdom existed in daily habits long before science could explain it. That the morning rice, the morning walk, these were not accidents. They were accumulated human knowledge expressed as culture, quietly effective, waiting for the right instruments to reveal why. I am 62 years old. I have spent 30 years studying the human body and trying to understand how it ages, how it accumulates disease, and how it heals. And one of the most useful things I have learned in those 30 years is that simple interventions, precise, mechanistically sound, easy to sustain, are almost always more powerful than complicated ones. Complexity is a barrier. Simplicity is what gets repeated every morning for 10 years. And 10 years of morning repetition is where transformation lives. 1 tablespoon of cold cooked rice, 20 to 30 minutes before your walk. Every morning. That is the protocol. It costs nothing. It takes 10 seconds. It doubles the fat-burning effect of a walk you are probably already taking. And over months and years of consistent application, it reshapes your gut microbiome, improves your insulin sensitivity, reduces visceral fat accumulation, and creates a resting metabolic baseline that works for you even when you are sitting still. I stayed awake until 5 in the morning that night, reading everything I could find. My tea was cold, my lamp was the only light on in the building, and I felt the way I imagine all researchers feel on the rare occasions when the pieces fall perfectly into place. Not just the satisfaction of understanding something, but the specific electric urgency of wanting to tell someone. This is me telling you, 1 spoon, before your walk, starting tomorrow morning.